Autumn 1944. A prisoner of war camp somewhere in the American Midwest. Barbed wire stretches across open fields, glinting under a pale morning sun. Guard towers stand silent. Inside the compound, German prisoners assemble in orderly rows, boots scuffing the dirt. Many are veterans of North Africa or Normandy. Others are barely out of their teens. All of them expect the same thing they have known since capture: work without choice. Obedience without reward. An American officer steps forward. An interpreter follows. The announcement is brief, calm, almost routine. Work details will begin after breakfast. Farm labor, road repair, forestry crews. Then the interpreter pauses and adds something that does not translate easily. They will be paid. A murmur spreads through the formation. Faces tighten. Some men laugh quietly, convinced this must be a mistake. Others stare at the ground, waiting for punishment to follow the joke. A few glance toward the guards, searching for signs of deception, but the officer produces envelopes, paper slips, stamped vouchers, real wages, for men raised on propaganda that described Americans as brutal exploiters. The moment feels unreal. Payment for labor was not something prisoners expected. Not from the enemy. Not in wartime. That morning, something subtle but irreversible begins to change inside the wire. Because when the enemy pays you for your work, captivity no longer fits the story you were told. And that contradiction will spread far beyond the camp fences. By the time American officers began organizing paid work details for German prisoners, the scale of captivity had already reached historic proportions. From late 1940 to onward after the Allied victories in North Africa, the campaigns in Italy, and especially following Normandy in June 1944, German soldiers were being captured in numbers no one had predicted. Entire units surrendered. Others were cut off, exhausted, or abandoned by retreating formations. By early 1945, more than 370,000 German Pows would be held inside the continental United States. They arrived by ship across the Atlantic, guarded but unharmed. Stepping onto American soil thousands of miles from the ruins of Europe, many expected harsh treatment. Some feared execution. Others believed captivity would mean hunger, beatings, and humiliation, ideas shaped by Nazi propaganda and, for some, by experiences on the Eastern Front. Instead, they encountered something unfamiliar. The United States had made a deliberate decision to follow the 1929 Geneva Convention on prisoners of war to the letter. That treaty required humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence or intimidation. It also allowed Pows to be required to work under strict conditions. They could not be forced into dangerous labor. They had to be supervised. And crucially, they had to be paid. Too many German prisoners. This legal framework was incomprehensible. In the Third Reich, forced labor was routine. Prisoners worked because they were prisoners. Payment was irrelevant. The idea that international law could protect captured soldiers from exploitation seemed naive or deceptive. Their expectations were shaped by ideology. Nazi instruction emphasized that Americans were decadent, cruel, and driven by profit. Prisoners were warned that the enemy would use them until they were broken. Some German officers even told their men that captivity in the West was worse than death. Yet from the moment they arrived in U.S. camps spread across Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arizona, the Midwest, and the Northeast, those assumptions began to erode. Camps were orderly. Food was sufficient, sometimes better than what German civilians were receiving at home. Medical treatment was prompt. Discipline was firm, but predictable still. Many prisoners believed this restraint would end once labor began. They were wrong. American officials faced a different problem. With millions of U.S. men deployed overseas, the domestic economy was stretched thin. Farms lacked hands. Timber operations slowed. Infrastructure projects stalled. The war effort demanded production, and prisoners represented a lawful, available workforce. But unlike Germany, the United States intended to use POW labor within the bounds of law, not ideology. That distinction would prove decisive. As the first work assignments were organized and explained, German prisoners prepared themselves for exploitation. They braced for coercion. They expected guards with rifles and threats. Instead, they were handed work schedules and pay rates. That moment of contradiction marked the beginning of a transformation inside the camps, one that would challenge not only German expectations of captivity, but their understanding of the enemy itself. And to grasp why that shock mattered, the story must turn to how and why the Americans made the decision to pay prisoners at all. The decision to pay German prisoners for their labor was not improvised. It was the product of legal obligation, economic necessity, and deliberate policy. By 1943, the United States faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas. Farms were struggling to harvest crops. Railways, forest, and food processing plants needed workers to keep the war economy functioning. Prisoners of war became part of the solution. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, captured nations were permitted to require enlisted Pows to work, provided the labor was non-military, not dangerous, and reasonably compensated. Officers could not be forced to work, but enlisted men could. Crucially, the convention specified that Pows must receive payment, either in cash or credited to individual accounts, at rates set by the captor nation, for the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office. This was not merely a legal detail. It was a framework to maintain discipline, order, and stability across a rapidly expanding Pows system. Paying prisoners reduced resistance, encouraged cooperation, and aligned camp administration with American values and international law. By 1944, a standardized system was in place. German Pows assigned to work details whether harvesting crops in Iowa, cutting timber in Oregon, repairing roads in Georgia, or working in canneries were paid an average of 80 cents per day, the rate mandated by U.S. Army regulations. The money was not handed out freely in cash. Instead, it was credited to individual prisoner accounts and issued as camp scrip or vouchers, usable at camp canteens. This distinction mattered. German prisoners could now purchase items themselves: soap, extra food, cigarettes, writing paper, books, musical instruments, even sports equipment. Choice, however limited, restored a sense of personal agency. For men stripped of uniform, rank, and homeland, that agency was profound. The reaction inside the camps was immediate and complex. At first, many prisoners assumed the payments were symbolic or temporary. Some suspected the Americans were manipulating them for propaganda. Others believed wages would be deducted later or used as leverage for punishment. But the payments continued. Week after week, month after month, work was assigned fairly. Hours were regulated. Pay was recorded meticulously. Camp commanders enforced the rules consistently, even when German prisoners protested or refused work. Discipline existed, but it was procedural, not brutal. This consistency unsettled many Pows more than cruelty would have. In Nazi ideology, the enemy was supposed to be chaotic, vengeful, and exploitative. Yet the Americans were behaving like administrators, not conquerors. The system did not rely on fear. It relied on routine, law, and predictability. German non-commissioned officers noticed the shift first. Men who worked regularly earned enough to improve their daily lives. Cooperation increased. Sabotage declined. The camps grew quieter, more orderly. For some prisoners, especially those who had served on the Eastern Front, the contrast was staggering. They had seen forced labor enforced by starvation and violence. Here, labor came with wages, schedules, and limits, and with each paid work detail. A dangerous realization took hold inside the wire. This was not how the enemy was supposed to behave. That realization would spread quietly, steadily reshaping attitudes, weakening ideology, and setting the stage for the deeper psychological transformation still to come. For the German Pows, the first wages did not bring relief. They brought confusion. Many prisoners have been conditioned to expect deception. Years of indoctrination warned them that the enemy would manipulate, humiliate, and exploit them. So when payment was announced, reactions ranged from quiet laughter to outright hostility. Some refused to accept the vouchers. Others hid them, convinced the money would later be used against them. Yet daily life has a way of testing beliefs. Work details were consistent. Hours were limited. Pay appeared on schedule. The vouchers bought real things: extra bread, soap, cigarettes, notebooks. Over time, suspicion gave way to something unfamiliar, a sense of dignity. Paid labor altered how prisoners saw themselves. They were no longer merely bodies under guard. They were workers, accountable for tasks, compensated for effort. Men who had been stripped of identity in defeat found a small but meaningful restoration of self-respect. Older Pows noticed the change first. They saw discipline improve, tempers cool, routines stabilize. Younger prisoners began volunteering for work details not to please guards, but to regain purpose in days that otherwise blurred into monotony. The shift was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no celebrations, just a slow recalibration of expectations, a realization that captivity did not automatically mean degradation. For men who had watched comrades die under forced labor elsewhere in the war, the contrast was haunting. Payment did not erase the fact of imprisonment, but it softened it enough to make survival feel human again, and that humanization would have consequences far beyond the camp fences. The decision to pay Pows was not an act of generosity. It was an assertion of values. American officials understood that how prisoners were treated would echo beyond the war itself. The Geneva Convention offered a legal baseline, but the United States went further in its enforcement. Camp commanders were instructed that respect for law was not optional even when dealing with the enemy. Pain. Pows served several purposes at once. It affirmed that captivity did not erase rights. It reduced unrest and resistance. It demonstrated that American authority rested on rules, not revenge. This restraint was intentional. U.S. leadership believed that cruelty would undermine discipline, fuel resentment, and invite retaliation against American Pows held elsewhere. Humane treatment, by contrast, reinforced legitimacy both internally and internationally. German prisoners noticed the difference. They were punished when they broke rules, but punishment followed procedures. They were ordered to work, but the work had limits. They were guarded, but guards were accountable. For Pows raised in a system where power was arbitrary and fear was currency, this consistency was disarming. It forced them to confront a contradiction, an enemy capable of total war, yet bound by restraint. The moral shock was subtle, but persistent. It chipped away at certainty. It raised questions no lecture could, and it laid the groundwork for a deeper, unraveling one that ideology alone could not withstand. Nazi ideology depended on clear divisions: enemy and ally, strength and weakness, cruelty, righteousness. Paid labor blurred those lines. Inside the camps, the act of receiving wages created cognitive dissonance. If Americans were brutal exploiters, why pay? If captivity meant degradation, why preserve dignity? If the enemy was morally bankrupt, why adhere so strictly to international law? Hardline Nazi prisoners tried to explain it away. Some claimed the payments were propaganda. Others warned fellow Pows that cooperation was betrayal. A few attempted intimidation, urging refusal of work details, but ideology weakened under routine. Men who worked regularly ate better. They slept better. They were calmer. The benefits were tangible, immediate, and difficult to deny. Over time, peer pressure shifted not toward resistance, but participation. Even those who remained loyal to the regime struggled to reconcile doctrine with experience. The contrast between what they had been taught and what they were living became impossible to ignore. This psychological erosion did not produce instant conversion. It produced doubt, and doubt in a system built on certainty was dangerous. With each paycheck, each purchase at the canteen, each day of lawful routine, the foundations of belief cracked a little more. The war against Nazi ideology was being fought not with slogans or force, but with consistency, law, and quiet contradiction, and that process was only beginning. Behind the moral and psychological effects of paying Pows lay a practical reality. The American war economy needed labor, and it needed it urgently. By 1944, farms across the Midwest and South were struggling to harvest crops. Timber operations slowed. Food processing plants faced shortages that threatened supply chains, feeding both civilian and soldiers overseas. German Pows filled that gap. They picked cotton in Texas and Alabama. They harvested corn and sugar beets in Iowa and Minnesota. They cut timber in Oregon, Washington. They repaired roads, loaded freight, and worked in canneries. Payment was essential to making the system function. Wages transformed compulsory labor into regulated employment. Pows worked set hours, completed assigned tasks, and returned to camp under guard, but without the constant friction that unpaid coercion creates. Inside the camps, the small sums added up. POW wages circulated through canteens, creating a controlled microeconomy. Men pooled money to buy books. Some purchased musical instruments and formed orchestras. Others saved their vouchers, uncertain what the future might bring for American administrators. The system worked. Productivity increased. Discipline improved. Resistance decreased. The camps became manageable, predictable environments rather than volatile holding pens. For the prisoners, the economic logic carried an unsettling implication. Their labor had value, and that value was being acknowledged by the enemy. In a war defined by destruction, that recognition mattered. It reframed captivity from pure punishment into participation in a structured, lawful system. And that reframing would ripple far beyond the balance sheets of farms and factories. The wage system did not succeed by accident. It was enforced by a professional bureaucracy, the U.S. Army Provost Marshal Corps, whose task was to administer POW camps with precision and consistency. Camp commanders received clear instructions: follow the Geneva Convention, document everything, apply discipline evenly, and avoid unnecessary force. Payment for labor was not negotiable. It was policy. This approach reflected a broader American philosophy of control. Authority came from rules, not terror. Compliance was achieved through routine, not brutality. Even guards were held accountable. Mistreatment of prisoners could result in disciplinary action. German Pows noticed this immediately. Officers could argue. Enlisted men could complain. Red Cross inspections were permitted. Mail was regulated but delivered. Wages were recorded and honored. The system left little room for arbitrary cruelty. For German prisoners, many of whom had served under a regime where authority was absolute and punishment unpredictable, this predictability was deeply unsettling. It contradicted everything they had been taught about power. Leadership within the camps understood the long-term implications. Humane treatment reduced unrest. But it also sent a message: the American system did not collapse under the pressure of war. That message, repeated daily through policy and practice, would outlast the barbed wire. Not all German Pows accepted the wage system quietly. Hardline Nazi loyalists viewed paid labor as dangerous. They feared it would weaken discipline, encourage cooperation, and undermine loyalty to the Reich. In some camps, they attempted to enforce informal boycotts of work details. Others threatened fellow prisoners who volunteered. These efforts rarely succeeded. The material benefits of paid work were too obvious. Men who refused labor watched others eat better, sleep better, and maintain morale. Over time, resistance isolated the ideologues rather than empowering them. Camp authorities monitored these tensions closely. Known agitators were separated. Leadership structures inside the camps were adjusted to prevent intimidation. The system favored moderation by design. German officers faced their own dilemma. They were not required to work, yet many watched enlisted men earn wages and stability while they remained idle. Some officers quietly acknowledged that American policy was eroding the old hierarchies of obedience. The most striking outcome was internal division. Not between Americans and Germans but among Germans themselves. Ideology fractured under the weight of daily experience. The camp became a place where belief was tested not by force, but by contrast. And as wages continued to be paid, as routines held, and as the war outside grew darker for Germany, the psychological center of gravity inside the camp shifted toward resignation, reflection, and in some cases, acceptance. That shift would reach its peak in the moments still to come. The turning point did not arrive with a riot, a speech, or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly on an ordinary payday. By mid-1944, paid labor had become routine across American POW camps. Work details moved out at dawn. Trucks returned by late afternoon. Vouchers were issued weekly. Canteens opened on schedule. The system was no longer experimental. It was stable. And that stability changed everything. For months, many German prisoners had waited for the moment when the mask would slip, when wages would stop, rules would tighten, or punishment would replace procedure. That moment never came. Instead, the system grew more predictable the longer the war continued. The realization spread slowly, but unmistakably. This was not temporary. In camps across Texas, Iowa, Louisiana, and Arizona, prisoners began to plan their days around work assignments. They calculated how much they could earn in a week. They discussed purchases. They saved vouchers. Some even debated which jobs were preferable, not because of ease, but because of purpose. That psychological shift marked the true climax. Men who had entered captivity expecting degradation were now participating in a structured economy, governed by rules they could understand. The power dynamic had changed. Guards still held authority. Prisoners were still confined. But the relationship was no longer defined solely by coercion. The impact was visible. Camp discipline improved without increased force. Work refusal dropped sharply. Violence inside the wire declined. Sabotage became rare. German non-commissioned officers reported fewer conflicts. American guards reported calmer camp. Red Cross inspectors noted order and compliance where tension had once dominated. Then came the moment that cemented the change. In several camps, prisoners were informed that unspent wages would be credited to personal accounts to be returned upon repatriation after the war. For men whose families were facing bombing, shortages, and collapse back in Germany, the implication was staggering. Their labor performed under captivity might outlast the war. That knowledge altered how many POWs viewed the future. Survival was no longer only about endurance. It now carried a sense of continuity, a bridge between captivity and whatever came next. Hardline loyalists tried once more to resist. They warned that cooperation was betrayal. They urged prisoners to reject the system, but their voices carried less weight each week. The men earning wages were not being punished. They were being rewarded with stability. The ideological battle inside the camps was being lost not through confrontation, but through comparison. As the war outside turned against Germany, the contrast sharpened. POWs received regular meals. They worked predictable hours. They were paid. Meanwhile, letters from home spoke of cities in ruins, shortages, and fear. The enemy's system was holding. The Reichs was collapsing, and in that contrast, the meaning of captivity shifted irreversibly. By the end of 1944, American camp commanders recognized the transformation. The camps were no longer volatile holding centers. They were controlled, orderly environments where the greatest struggle was internal between belief and experience. That internal struggle would reach its final resolution as the war itself approached its end. As 1945 approached, the war beyond the barbed wire began to intrude more sharply into camp life. News filtered in through newspapers, Red Cross bulletins, and guarded conversations. German prisoners learned of the Allied crossing of the Rhine, the fall of major cities, and the steady collapse of the front lines they once defended. With that knowledge came a final reckoning. For many POWs, the wage system now stood in stark contrast to everything they heard from home. Letters described hunger, destroyed factories, and families surviving on ration scraps. Civilian wages in Germany had lost meaning amid shortages and inflation. Forced labor had become harsher, more desperate, more brutal. Inside the American camps, the situation was the opposite. Work continued, payment continued. Order held. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. German prisoners began speaking openly, sometimes for the first time, about the future. Conversations shifted from victory and returned to questions of survival, reconstruction, and responsibility. Men who had once dismissed paid labor as a trick now acknowledged it as real, consistent, and lawful. The psychological climax arrived when prisoners realized something deeply unsettling. They were living under a system that worked, not because it was kind, but because it was structured. Not because it was generous, but because it was predictable. Not because it was weak, but because it was confident enough to follow its own rules even in war. American camp records from early 1945 reveal a striking trend. Voluntary compliance increased sharply. Work productivity rose. Requests for educational materials, books, language courses, technical manuals became common. Some camps organized classes, discussion groups, and vocational training, funded in part by prisoner wages. This was not rehabilitation by force. It was adaptation by exposure. German officers, once rigid enforcers of hierarchy, found their authority diminished. Enlisted men who worked and earned had leverage they never possessed before. Respect began shifting away from rank and toward reliability. The enemy's ideology was unraveling quietly. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the news was received with mixed emotions inside the camps. Shock, relief, fear of the unknown, but also clarity. The system governing their captivity did not collapse with the Reich. It remained intact. Wages were still accounted for. Records were still kept. Repatriation plans were methodical, not chaotic, for many Pows. The final surrender confirmed what they had already sensed. The war had been lost long before the last shot was fired. Not just militarily, but structurally. The American system they experienced daily had endured. The one they served had not. That realization marked the true end of resistance, not in the field, but in the mind. And as the camps began preparing for repatriation, the significance of paid labor took on its final meaning, not as a wartime convenience, but as a lesson carried home by hundreds of thousands of former prisoners. The consequences of that lesson would not be immediate, but they would be lasting. When the war in Europe ended, the barbed wire did not come down immediately. German prisoners remained in American camps for months, some into 1946, as transportation, security, and reconstruction plans were put in place. During that time, the wage system continued methodical, documented, unchanged by the collapse of the regime that had sent these men to war. For many prisoners, this period was the most reflective. They were no longer soldiers awaiting orders. They were no longer enemies in an active conflict. They were men preparing to return to a shattered homeland. American authorities finalized wage accounts, ensuring that each prisoner's earnings were recorded. In many cases, those funds were converted into credits usable upon return or accounted for during repatriation. For men returning to a Germany with destroyed industry, collapsed currency, and scarce employment, the memory of being paid, of having labor recognized, stood in stark contrast to what awaited them. The journey home was sobering. German Pows returned to cities reduced to rubble. Infrastructure was broken. Food shortages were severe. Civil authority was fragile. Many discovered that family members had been killed or displaced. Jobs were non-existent. In some regions, former soldiers were viewed with suspicion or resentment. Against that backdrop, the experience of American captivity took on new meaning. In interviews conducted years later, former Pows consistently described their time in U.S. camps as orderly, lawful, and unexpectedly humane. The wages, though small, became symbolic evidence that even in defeat, dignity had not been entirely stripped away. Some prisoners compared their treatment with that of civilians forced into labor inside the collapsing Reich. Others contrasted it with accounts from comrades held elsewhere. The difference was not forgotten. American policymakers had anticipated this effect. They believed that how Germany's soldiers experienced defeat would influence how Germany itself rebuilt. Humane captivity was not weakness. It was investment in stability. By paying Pows, the United States demonstrated that law could function even after violence ended. The consequences extended beyond individual memory. Former Pows carried these experiences into post-war society. Many became workers, technicians, farmers, and civil servants in the new Germany. Their first-hand knowledge of lawful authority, predictable systems, and paid labor shaped how they understood reconstruction. In some cases, the influence was personal and direct. A number of former Pows later returned to the United States as immigrants. Others maintained correspondence with Americans they had met during captivity. The wages they earned became part of a larger narrative, a reminder that the enemy had treated them not as expendable labor, but as human beings bound by law. The war had ended in ruins, but the memory of structured fairness endured, and as Germany struggled to rebuild, those memories would quietly influence how former soldiers viewed power, responsibility, and the meaning of work in a society emerging from catastrophe. In the years that followed repatriation, the experience of paid labor in American POW camps lingered in ways few policymakers could have fully predicted. It did not produce instant admiration or erase the devastation of defeat, but it planted a quiet reference point, an example of how authority could function without fear. Former German Pows spoke of it cautiously at first. Post-war Germany was a country in moral and physical collapse. Open discussion of wartime experiences was fraught with guilt, denial, and exhaustion. Yet in private conversations, memoirs, and later interviews, a consistent theme emerged. Captivity in the United States had been different. Men remembered the work details. They remembered the pay vouchers. They remembered being treated as accountable individuals rather than expendable tools. These recollections contrasted sharply with the chaos of post-war life. In a nation where forced labor had been normalized and wages often meaningless, the idea that work could be regulated, compensated, and dignified resonated deeply. Historians studying POW narratives have noted how frequently American camps are mentioned in discussions of post-war outlook. Former prisoners describe learning patience, cooperation, and routine skills that proved essential in rebuilding a society from ruins. Some carried the lesson into leadership roles, others into trade unions, engineering projects, or local administration. The wage system, small as it was, had reinforced a basic principle: labor and law were linked. The long-term diplomatic consequences were subtle but real. As West Germany aligned itself with democratic institutions and market economics, the memory of lawful treatment by former enemies helped soften resistance to partnership. Former Pows were not a political movement, but they were a generation shaped by experience rather than propaganda. In some cases, that experience altered life paths entirely. Thousands of former German Pows applied to emigrate to the United States in the late 1940s and 1950s. They returned not as captives, but as workers, students, and citizens. The memories of paid labor under captivity had reshaped their understanding of opportunity. American officials later reflected on the POW program with quiet satisfaction. It had maintained order, upheld law, and delivered economic value during wartime. But more importantly, it had demonstrated restraint when vengeance would have been easier. The payment of wages was never intended as moral theater. It was administrative, legal, routine, yet its impact endured precisely because it was ordinary. In a war defined by extremes, the most powerful lesson for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers came not from violence but from consistency, and that consistency would frame how many of them understood the post-war world that followed. In a war remembered for brutality, destruction, and absolute hatred, the story of paid labor inside American POW camps stands apart not because it was dramatic, but because it was restrained. The United States did not pay German prisoners to be kind. It paid them because the law required it, and because order works better than fear. That distinction matters. Inside the wire, wages did something weapons could not. They forced men raised on absolutist ideology to confront contradiction, an enemy powerful enough to defeat them, yet disciplined enough to restrain itself. A system that did not rely on terror to function. A structure where rules applied even when no one was watching. For German Pows, this experience quietly dismantled certainty, not through argument, not through humiliation, but through routine, through predictability, through the simple act of earning something for honest work. The war ended in ruins, but those routines endured in memory. Years later, former prisoners would struggle to explain why captivity in America lingered so strongly in their minds. It was not comfort they remembered, it was coherence. A sense that authority could be firm without being cruel, that labor could be regulated rather than exploited, that defeat did not have to mean dehumanization. In the aftermath of total war, these ideas mattered. Germany's reconstruction depended not only on aid and infrastructure, but on belief that a different system was possible. For hundreds of thousands of former soldiers, that belief had first taken shape behind barbed wire, earning wages from an enemy who followed its own rules. The payment of POW wages did not win battles. It did not shorten the war. It did not erase responsibility, but it achieved something quieter and more enduring. It weakened an ideology by refusing to imitate it. It replaced fear with procedure. And it showed that power, when restrained by law, could survive victory without losing its character. In a conflict defined by extremes, that lesson remains one of the most overlooked and most powerful legacies of the war. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary every single day.